This happened maybe 8 or 9 months after I moved into my first house. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of college with a decent job. All you need to know about the house is that it had a very spacious basement that I mostly used for storage. The previous owners had partitioned it into these separate rooms using plywood and exposed framing. There was the main area at the bottom of the stairs, then a laundry section, then what I think was supposed to be a workshop, and then this weird back room that was mostly just storage. It had kind of a maze-like quality to it. You couldn't see the entire basement from any single vantage point, which I remember thinking was kind of cool when I first toured the place. Anyway, it was a weeknight. I needed to go downstairs to do laundry, which was the only time I ever really went down there. The basement lights were already on, which I thought was weird, but I didn't dwell on it for whatever reason. I'd been down there a few days earlier, so I figured I just forgot to turn them off. The space was dim even with the lights. I hadn't bothered changing the old yellow incandescents that had been there when I moved in. I started walking down the stairs, and things escalated so abruptly that I couldn't react quick enough. I made it to the bottom of the stairs and started walking toward the laundry area when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I turned my head instinctively and locked eyes with a man who was crouching behind one of the folding tables that I had set up near the far corner. It was so unsettling that I almost dropped the basket. My brain refused to register what I was seeing. There was literally a stranger hiding in my basement. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at this intruder who was now staring back at me, and it was not a pleasant stare. He looked like he had just crawled out of a sewer or something. And then he stood up and ran. Not at me though, further into the basement toward the partitioned rooms in the back. That snapped me out of my fear-induced haze, and I started moving backwards toward the basement stairs. But I must have wasted too much time, because before I could reach the stairs, all the lights in the basement went out. Until that moment, I had never been down there with the lights off. I hadn't anticipated how dark it would be. It was fully pitch black down there, complete and utter darkness. I mistakenly assumed I knew my own house, so I kept moving toward the stairs, but I must have misjudged something, because I tripped and fell to the floor. By the time I got up, I was completely disoriented. The chaos and fear of the situation was overwhelming my brain, and I couldn't think. My phone was sitting on the counter upstairs, so it's not like I could just reach in my pocket and turn on the flashlight. I started screaming like a lunatic, thinking that might scare off whoever had broken into my house. But actually, that strategy must have energized them, because I started hearing screaming coming from the other side of the basement. It was terrifying. I was screaming into the darkness, trying to seem like I was crazy, and someone on the other side of the room was doing the same exact thing, and his screaming was much more intimidating than mine. He legitimately sounded like a murderer. I stopped screaming, and he followed suit. I started navigating around the basement purely by touch. I had no other choice, and I started hearing movement behind me. He must have been doing the same. The sounds were getting closer, and amidst the horror of everything, I couldn't help but get the sense that he knew my own basement better than I did. I knew I was getting closer to the stairs, but that basement is massive. I started hearing breathing coming from somewhere behind me, and I genuinely thought he was going to catch me. After what felt like an eternity, I felt the wooden base of the staircase. I grabbed the railing and started running up the stairs, but before I could even hit the second step, something grabbed my ankle and I lost my grip. My head struck the railing and I fell all the way down to the basement floor. I still couldn't see the guy, but he was dragging me away from the stairs with what genuinely felt like inhuman strength. I kicked and thrashed my legs with all my might and miraculously connected with something. The strike was just strong enough for him to lose his grip, and I twisted and twisted until I escaped his grasp. I started running back towards the stairs in the dark, and he started screaming again, but I found them before he could catch me. I made it to the top in the dark, burst through the door, and slammed it shut behind me. The nightmare was far from over, though. That door doesn't have a lock, so I had no choice but to press my weight against it and hope I was strong enough to keep him out. Just as I suspected, I heard footsteps pounding up the basement stairs mere seconds later, followed by a huge crash against the door. The door swung open for a terrifying second, and it took everything in my power to push it closed. The first impact must have emboldened him because he started repeatedly slamming into the door. I yanked off my socks and pushed against the door, knowing my life depended on it. I have no idea how he did make it through, but he eventually gave up. I heard footsteps crashing back down the basement stairs, and I immediately seized the opportunity to grab my phone. I ran over to the counter, grabbed it, and ran back to the basement door. With my back pressed against the door again, I called the police. When they finally arrived, that guy was gone. I kind of had a feeling. One of the basement windows had been forced open from the outside, and it didn't take a genius to figure out what happened. There was nothing missing or stolen, so one of the officers suggested that the intruder was probably using my basement as a place to live or hide. That hadn't crossed my mind, but it was somehow a worse thought than him simply wanting to rob the place. The other reason the police arrived at that theory was that the intruder somehow knew where the light switch was, which wasn't in the most obvious place. It made sense. I ended up moving out about 4 months after the incident. Thinking about this again has confirmed something for me. That guy was fully prepared to kill me that night, and if things had played out differently, he just might have. This happened when I was 14. I'm in my 30s now, so we're talking close to 20 years ago at this point. My parents had to drive out of state for a wedding and didn't want to leave me alone, despite the fact that I was staying at home alone age. So the original plan was for my older sister to stay with me for the weekend. She was already in college at the time, but she only lived an hour away. As soon as my parents left, though, she texted me and told me she had some party to go to and wasn't going to come. I didn't really care. I didn't even bother telling my parents about it, partly because I didn't want to stress them out and partly because I didn't want them to find someone else to watch me. It wasn't like the house was in some sketchy area either. It was a typical 2-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The place mostly consisted of families too, so I knew I'd be fine. The evening was completely uneventful. I played Halo for like 6 hours, something I'd ordinarily never get to do. It wasn't until just after midnight where things started getting weird. I was still lounging on the couch when I heard this faint tapping sound. The sound came from somewhere in the backyard, and I immediately assumed it was something hitting the siding of the house. That's honestly what it sounded like, so I wasn't too concerned. A few minutes later, though, I heard it again. The sound was nearly identical, which gave me the impression that it was a tree branch hitting the same spot on the house. But then the tapping migrated, like whatever was making it was moving along the side of the house. That's when I knew something was wrong. The sound was far too intentional to not be made by something sentient. I muted the TV and froze. I didn't want to move. I just sat there listening the way anyone would, but now there was just silence. After maybe a minute, I convinced myself that it had just been a scuttling animal or the wind, and I turned the TV back on. 20 minutes later, there was a new noise, one that made me a lot more concerned. It was another tapping sound. But this time, it sounded like it was coming from below me, from the basement. The living room was directly above the basement, so it had to be coming from there. It was an unfinished basement with a little kitchenette in the corner, so it wasn't crazy to imagine a critter rummaging around in there. I muted the TV again, this time getting up off the couch. I was dreading it, but I had to check. I had to at least assure myself that nothing was wrong. The basement had several windows that led directly to the outdoors, so in all likelihood, the raccoon or stray cat that had been making the first noise was now knocking against one of those windows for whatever reason. I tried to convince myself I wasn't freaking out and walked over to the basement door. I opened it and stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness. The tapping noise was louder now, happening every few seconds or so. I don't know why I did this, but I called out hello into the nothingness. The tapping stopped immediately. That's when I started feeling really uneasy, because if it had just been an animal, it probably wouldn't have reacted to my voice like that. If I could just turn on the lights, I'd get a much clearer view of everything. But the light switch was at the bottom of the stairs, and there was a 0% chance I was going down there. So instead, I swung the door closed until it was only open a crack, and stuck my hand through. I pointed my phone over to where I knew the window was. Then I closed my eyes and recorded a video with the flash on for a few seconds. Then I immediately shut the door and locked it. I took a deep breath and pulled up the video. It was pretty grainy, but it took me all of 1 second to realize there was a figure standing underneath one of the windows, on the inside of the house. I screamed. I couldn't control myself, and I ran to my room. I locked the door and immediately called my dad, who called the police for me. I was still on the phone with my parents when I started hearing repeated banging on the basement door. That guy was trying to break into the finished part of our house. And then, after the 5th or 6th bang or so, there was silence again, and then the police showed up. They searched the basement, but that guy had escaped through the window. The officers were actually nice enough to search our yard, but that guy was long gone. There was a bunch of stuff missing from the basement. Like I said before, it wasn't finished, but that didn't mean my parents left it empty. I can't remember everything that had been stolen, but the scariest thing by far was this. When the police inspected the kitchenette, they found the biggest knife in the rack missing. It was a terrifying thought. If it weren't for the video on my phone, I don't think the police would have taken things as seriously as they did. But of course, nothing ever came of it, and this was almost 20 years ago now. I have no idea what happened to that old phone. It's probably buried in a box of junk in my parents' house somewhere, if it even still exists. If I ever find it and the thing still turns on, I'll submit the footage.